paper, tackling climate change to an economist is easy. You just put a price on carbon. And you either do it through a carbon tax or you put in place a cap and trade market. Now, in practice, turning that idea into something that actually works is anything but simple, especially if you want to do it at the scale of one of the world's biggest economies and as the first region to try it. So today, we're going to unpack 20 years of the European Union's emission trading system, the EU ETS. We'll look at how it started, what went wrong, what got fixed, and what's coming next. So by the end of this episode, you'll be able to answer questions such as, why did the EU choose cap and trade instead of a carbon tax? Or, why were carbon prices so low for so long? And what steps did the Commission take to fix that? Or finally, how does the history of the EU ETS inform the current challenges as the EU ETS expands to new sectors and pushes industry to further decarbonize? And today I'm joined by Professor Jos Delbeke. He's the former Director General for Climate Action at the European Commission and one of the key architects of the EU emissions trading system. He now holds the EIB Chair on Climate Policy and International Carbon Markets, and he was the Commission's lead climate negotiator in the run-up to the Paris Agreement. So Jos, welcome to the podcast.
My pleasure to be with you today.
It's a great honor to have you here. So I would say let's start at the very beginning. If people remember only one thing about the EU ETS, its origin story, its purpose, what should that one thing be?
Well, it started as a splendid economic idea. Economists wanted to make a contribution to climate change, and they make a plea for economic instruments, and there were many blueprints. But having a blueprint is one thing. Having it implemented in real life is another thing, because the world is changing. En cours de route, you have to make changes and you have to adapt the system. And you can also not have a system entirely sketched out in the beginning in all its details. So it has a gradual development, and that's why we had different phases. Every 5 years, more or less, we were reviewing the legislation, and that was very beneficial. So the build-up of a new element in climate policy took time to mature, but I think today we can say the system is there and works fairly well. We have a good price, and we are reducing the emissions with more than 50% today compared to when we started in 2005. So I think we are now going into the next phase and into another discussion, because we have the war in Ukraine, we are moving out of gas as much as possible. We are having big changes in the field of energy, and we have our industry that still needs to decarbonize. So the landscape within which the EU ETS is functioning is again changing and requires again a review and a rethinking.
So thanks for that. And one thing I think this episode will also show is, like you say, there's a blueprint that gets created, but then a gradual implementation and revision. I think people sometimes have the expectation it will just go from scratch, which it's hard to do ex ante, because like you say, there's a lot of uncertainties. Could you then maybe give us a broad overview of the different phases of the EU ETS?
Indeed, and I think getting started was the most difficult point. So if other people internationally are asking me, Brazilians, the Turkish, they are developing their own emissions trading system, my advice is get started. And get started with those sectors on which the monitoring, reporting, verification, the MRV question, is the most easy to develop. And that was a very important choice that we did at the beginning, to concentrate on the energy sector and manufacturing industry. Now we are going to go with ETS2 into households, etc. But, at the time, we deliberately were making a choice for the big polluters, because the administration that you require to get the emissions tracked, emissions traded, is one element only. You have to have a good compliance system. And so that was and still is a quite demanding job to do. So there we started with energy and industry. And the other problem we normally have in the European Union is the competence issue. How far member states let you go. And we started with economic instruments and economic incentives as the economists were contributing to the debate. And we started with a tax, because that's the most obvious way to go. But matters of taxation are decided with unanimity. Now, unanimity in the EU is a very, very challenging road, to make materialize and to implement. And so, after somewhat a decade of trying out a combined carbon and energy tax, we switched around the thinking, and instead of defining the price, we defined the quantity, the maximum quantity to be emitted. And that quantity, of course, the cap, goes down over time and allows flexibility to economic operators. And that flexibility was very important because businesses had to come on board. And businesses were not on board spontaneously, but they hated a tax. They were prepared to go for an economic instrument, for economic incentives, everything but a tax. And so we could ride on that, involvement of businesses that were engaging in the climate agenda, that were willing to do something. And something that was very dear to industry was cost effectiveness, reducing the emissions at the lowest cost possible. And so the emissions trading system was the perfect thing to go. And we got a good dynamic with the Commissioner Wallström at the time, who immediately picked up the ETS. She was a Swedish commissioner. She was open to economic incentives, and she was convinced that we had to start during the period that she was commissioner. So it was decided that we had to start with the system in 2005, because many political projects are getting started, but then fall off the table, when a new commissioner or a new commission comes in. And she was a clever politician, and she said, yes, we go for it, and it must start before I leave this office. And so we had a very clear timetable to get started, and that helped as well to have a dynamic, with businesses, with NGOs, with member states, with all those involved. And that's how we started in 2005, which is before the Kyoto Protocol was entering into force, because the entry into force of the Kyoto Protocol was 2008. And that helped us, because there were so many uncertainties around, to describe phase one, 2005, 2008, as a pilot phase. As a pilot phase in which there would be no banking of allowances from phase one, that ended in 2008, and to the next phase that would start in 2008 until 2012, the first period that we were committing emissions reductions under the Kyoto Protocol. And that helped a lot in having that pilot phase, because you have to make an estimate of the cap. And the member states did not want to leave that estimate entirely to the European Commission to do that. So there was a little bit of a difficult exercise to get the cap defined. But the fact that there was no banking was a relief to many of us. And we concentrated on the MRV question. We knew that
Could you just define the MRV question?
Well, the tracking of emissions, you needed to create an obligation to companies to trace their emissions. And we needed to set up a verification system so that whatever companies were putting in their report on emissions was verified by a third party. And that verification process, of course, needed to be done, from the start. Otherwise, if there is no trust in each other's data, you don't get the market running. And so we were concentrating on the essentials, on which players were we having the most confidence, on which elements, are we having the most confidence to make the reporting of the emissions and the verification that needed to take place. Now, the member states wanted to do most of the job, and they did. And, they were having a big say on the cap and on the allocation process. The allocation was mostly done for free, There was no auctioning platform. And so the member states, had a hidden concern to protect their industries. And there was an inherent tendency to inflate the overall cap. And we were well aware of that. Where we were not aware of is that after year one, the over allocation was so clear that the prices tended to zero. And that was a major wake up call to all involved, to the businesses, to the member states, to the Commission, that when we started all over in 2008, we had to have much better data. And how did we get the better data? By getting started, because the monitoring and reporting and the verification system was in place to phase one, and was the perfect point of departure for the second period, 2008, 2012. And from that period on, we allowed banking because we had a much bigger sight on who was emitting what precisely. We had a perfect database. I think that very many environmental regulations, that were developed at the time as well, taken the field of waste or water or air quality, were just envying us that the database with which we started the second phase in 2008 was that much better compared to many other pieces of legislation. So we used the pilot phase to set up the essentials of the system. And in phase two, then we got, of course, a much more political debate about the cap and the allocation process. And perhaps we can go into that
Yeah.
in the next phase of our discussion.
Yeah. Thank you. And I think one thing is that I definitely find worth emphasizing is 2005 is 20 years ago now.
Yeah.
And technology in IT also was not at the state it is now. I feel like there's been also a lot of development. So
Yeah.
going back in time, it was just a much bigger challenge. I recently talked to someone about the new clean air markets in India, but technology has grown since then. So it must have been a huge effort, I think, to get this. And it sounds you really used this phase one to get the measurement and verification problem right, so that all the rest, which is built upon it, can follow.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely. That was the orientation of phase one. And phase two started about real emission reductions. And the biggest amount of emission reductions realized starting in 2008 until today has been in the power sector. And in the power sector at that time, we had a lot of coal fired power generation. And we substituted that gradually through gas fired power generation. And I think the fuel switching from coal to gas was, supported a lot. Through the carbon market and also through decisions that CEOs were making, because there was one psychological variable that does not need to be underestimated in this discussion, is that as soon as there was an agreement on the ETS, CEOs knew that a price for their pollution would have to be paid. Nobody knew how high the price would be, but that the price would have to be paid was sinking in the boardrooms of companies. And so the psychological element, you have in the future, you will have to pay for your pollution, was having a very important impact. And that's also why in the first period, the prices were not too bad. The prices were around 20, 25 euros, which was much better compared to what we got later on when we were facing the realities of the economic recession following the banking crisis of 2008 primarily. So I think that psychological variable was a very useful one. And companies, in particular in the energy sector, saw a way out, which was the switching away from coal to gas. Or when we decided about the power stations, no longer to go for coal, but to invest straight away into gas. So the gas dependency of Europe, was encouraged through the ETS system because, gas is a much less fossil intensive fuel compared to coal. Yeah.
it sounds like you're describing CEOs were becoming aware they would have to have this price, like this awareness of the incentives. They can start making plans. They can start preparing for what can we do, how can we switch, as like this realization like this is happening?
That was indeed a very important one, and several companies were using from that moment on an internal shadow price for investment decisions that they were making. It was a wild guess where the price on the carbon market would go, on the ETS market would go, but they made their own guess, their own benchmark. And several of them used 25 euros or 50 euros. Later on, they used the benchmark and still use the benchmark of 100 euros, for their internal plans. So just as to have, plans considered on a rational basis. And I think that is what the economists should realize, that expectations are being formed. Everybody has its own expectation, but these expectations were included into investment decisions that will last for 10, 15, 20, 25 years, the lifetime of a plant, that is normally taking place.
Maybe that's then a transition to starting in 2008 when there was like the political discussion, as you said, what are our reduction targets, and then the financial crisis also hitting. So could you maybe elaborate on those aspects?
Well, we had one guidance, which was an important one at the time, and that is that we committed to an emission reduction under the Kyoto Protocol between 2008 and 2012. And that emission reduction defined the overall effort of the EU. And of course, the overall effort of the EU was partly the EU ETS covered sectors, industry and energy, and a lot of other sectors, households, heating, transport, etc. So in the modeling, we were carving out which part of that cap needed to be secured by emission reductions in these covered sectors, and which ones or which part would be left for the member states for addressing households, etc. Now, that was much easier done in consultancy work and in analysis work, but that was not easily accepted by the member states. And the member states wanted to have a big handle in the allocation system, and in particular, deciding on the rules for free allocation. And I think the first phase was a phase where auctioning did not yet exist. One or the other member state, or I think we had 1 or 2% of auctioning, because one or the other member state preferred to try out the system of auctioning. But in those years, there became a huge criticism on the EU ETS, in particular on the power sector, because the power sector has no trading with the trading outside with partners from outside Europe is marginal. It's 1 or 2%. And so the power sector is a truly European sector. And so the argument behind free allocation was to cope with competitiveness disadvantages that our system may create for those exporting steel, chemicals, cement, etc., to world markets. So the free allocation argument worked much more for the industrial sectors, but not at all for the power sector. And what we observed is that the power sector was including into the price of electricity the price of carbon allowances that they got for free. And so we got into a debate about the windfall profits. They pretended they had to pay for their carbon emissions, but they get the overwhelming majority of allowances for free. And so the debate on windfall profits was, taking shape. And there was an agreement growing that in the next phase, auctioning for the power sector should become the rule. And I think that became the rule. In phase 3, we could elaborate on that. And the system of free allowances was limited to the manufacturing sectors. And I think that was a major step forward, potentially because there were revenues raised that could be used in a wise manner. We created the Innovation Fund, we created the Modernization Fund, and of course, most of the revenues were going back to the member states. What we could not do at the time was condition the revenues, to condition the ways the revenues member states would spend, on climate purposes. They were very jealous, to do with the revenues of the ETS whatever they like to do. And it is only later in phase four that there was a requirement to use the revenues from the ETS for climate purposes, for climate policy purposes. Some used it for innovation, others for insulation of homes and all the rest of it. But, the conditioning of the revenues came in later. We could not yet do that in phase two. The real thing was to get away from free allocation for the power sector, to get much more auctioning, and to have common rules for the free allocation for the manufacturing industry. And through that process, we gradually were Europeanizing the decision-making process on the EU ETS. In the beginning, it was very much dominated by the member states. But, auctioning is a process that is escaping to a large extent the attention of the member states. And we were pleading in favor of a common auctioning platform that indeed later on, not in phase two, but later on we could realize the EEX in Leipzig is doing the auctioning, of the allowances under the EU ETS. So that common auctioning platform was a long story before member states were letting that competence go, but you were reassured that they would get the money back without any other interference from the European Commission, except for the Innovation Fund and the Modernization Fund. So, and that worked well, and that reassured, member states as well.
So then maybe switching from allocation, which I think we can get back to later on carbon leakage and CBAM maybe, to the topic that you raised earlier of what are the emission targets. But as I understand it, in phase two, they were still set nationally. And then in phase three, they were EU-wide.
Yeah.
How was that a gradual process too, where because you said in phase one, there was this over allocation, but everybody was a little bit off guard how much it was. What was then evolution then in phase two towards phase three?
Well, that was the realization that we had to implement the Kyoto Protocol commitment of 2008, 2012, where we would reduce our emissions with a preset percentage. And so that was a common European-wide effort that we were committed to. And so we had to translate that towards the ETS sectors compared to the sectors that were directly managed by the member states, these households and transport in particular, and agriculture. So the business sector, which is the power and the manufacturing industry sectors, were subject of more and more European-wide considerations, because we were opening the market, we were liberalizing the electricity market, we were opening the internal market for goods and services. So that these were the years of Jacques Delors, and the following years where creating the single market was the centerpiece of the European construction. And so we brought that in through the EU ETS as well, that we had a European-wide coverage in which the system would gradually become totally harmonized, implemented by the member states, but totally harmonized. And that improved, in my view, a lot the cost effectiveness of the system, because you are chasing the lowest costs, related to emissions reduction. And that the wider the scale was, the more you were coming closer to realizing the goal of cost effectiveness. And I think the theoretical literature was confirming that, because before the ETS started, the British started their debate on a carbon market. But UK is a limited market compared to a very liquid and wide market such as the EU. Also, Denmark had attempts to create its own Danish emissions trading system, but Denmark is a small country compared to the liquid European market. And so we were winning that argument of a single market for carbon allowances, and that was creeping in gradually. Now, every time we were trying to put that into legislation, that was not easily, put forward. It was easily put forward, but not easily agreed. But, in the end, we got there. Yeah.
Maybe then we can use that to also discuss the financial crisis of 2008, which as I understand it, led to a drop in production and a drop in emissions,
Yeah.
which caused an oversupply. I'm telling the story now my
Yeah.
own way, but caused an oversupply, which then put some downward pressure on prices. How was this experienced? Because if you set a cap, it's not necessarily per se bad that emissions go down due to some exogenous shock. So that's my framing to say I read a lot of like prices were low, there was an oversupply. What was kind of the perception, and then what steps did you try to take towards that?
Yes, the perception was there that prices were very low, and there was a debate grumbling, in the background. Does the EU ETS serve its purpose, with such low prices? Now, there were two, three things that I need to add to what you were saying. Indeed, the industrial recession created an oversupply of allowances compared to the cap we had set forward for the period. That's absolutely correct. But there was a second element, the Kyoto Protocol element, where we were agreeing under the Kyoto Protocol that a fair amount of carbon credits that were realized in foreign countries and developing countries could enter into the EU. Now, we agreed to that, assuming that Russia, Australia, Canada, United States would play ball on that international carbon market or market for carbon credits. But in the end, they all bailed out. It started with the United States, and all these credits that were generated under the Kyoto Protocol came en masse to Europe. So we had an oversupply because of the economic recession. And on top of that, we had the import of carbon credits because even if the price was low, it was better to have a guaranteed price in the EU than nothing whatsoever in other places in the world. And in the end, we imported 1.6 billion carbon credits over the period that we had that opening for the Kyoto Protocol. So we had to act on both elements. We had an oversupply, and we started in asking the UN to tighten up the rules for carbon credits because there were scams and there were irregularities, in the creation of these carbon credits, which they did not do. To my frustration, I was the G then. And so we initiated a process to close the carbon market, our ETS market, for carbon credits that came from foreign countries, from developing countries. So that is still leading until today to a debate whether we should reopen the carbon market, our ETS market, for such credits created under the Paris Agreement. But that's another debate. I think we should do that. But at the time we had an oversupply, and one element in cutting down the oversupply was to no longer accept those credits coming from carbon credits. The second element, to which it took a long time before we got it through, was to put the oversupply in the market into a fridge which we call today the Market Stability Reserve. It was a long story. We were trying to bring or postpone a number of allowances, that we would not bring to the auctioning platform and things like that. But only the Market Stability Reserve really did the trick. And that is all about defining a rule, and when too many allowances come on the market and they are not absorbed, then they go into a fridge and they can come back later. So the Market Stability Reserve, a tool from the financial, circuits, worked fairly well. Even the night that we had the agreement, prices started to move upwards from, 5-6 euros we had at the time. And we were jumping to a price level of 25-30 euros in record time, in a couple of months. We left the low prices behind us. And then came on top of that the European Green Deal. And the European Green Deal changed the expectations about the future tight cap even more. And then we were growing with the price from a 30 euro level to 50, 60, 70, 80, with even a record price of 100 euros in February of 2023. But the repair we had in the price level was partly done through closing down the market for international carbon credits, the creation of the Market Stability Reserve, and then the expectations under the European Green Deal. Those three elements are very important three elements that can explain the price level we have today. We also have a little bit of a recession. Prices are around 75, 80 euros, which is a decent price if we look back at where we are coming from. And decent price, the price works as a disincentive to pollute. And we see that the emissions are going down. So the incentive mechanism works. And that is a very important element that we have to consider. Some would say the price needs to go higher. Others complain about the price being too high. I think the price level we are having is doing the job. And that's the most important element.
And with doing the job, you mean exactly incentivizing companies to most cost effectively reduce emissions among each other, among the EU pool.
Yeah, absolutely. There is, however, one dimension that we now entering into is that after 20 years of the EU ETS, the cheapest emission reductions have been reaped, have been realized. And in the coming 20 years, the most expensive and most difficult emission reductions are be the ones that we have to realize. That means we will not only need a relatively high carbon price like we have today, but we also do not want to reach our climate targets simply by closing industry. So we want industry to invest in decarbonized equipment and investments. And that is now the new challenge that is translated in the Clean Industrial Deal, which is, accelerating and motivating industries to go into decarbonized investment programs instead of importing more from foreign countries and close down economic activity. So that Clean Industrial Deal thinking is fairly new. And it is not by accident, because most of emission reductions were realized in the power sector. And most of the work is done there with lots of renewables coming in, etc. But the big part of the job is how to decarbonize in the manufacturing sectors. And that is where the Clean Industrial Deal investments, how to facilitate investments, how to have the clean technology, used in our companies, mostly risky projects, which makes the question about guarantees that need to be developed, etc., for facilitating the investment decisions in the manufacturing industry.
Then maybe two follow-up questions there is, as we've discussed, there's the blueprint that you have, then there's the reality, there's unexpected developments. There's a lot of learning by doing. Given that you've also talked to people from other regions, like EU has experimented with policy and, like you say, repaired it along the way, learned. What lessons did you feel like other regions could have learned from this that they now no longer have to do themselves, so to say, with experimentation?
The most important and the most difficult lesson of all this is that you need a good governance system. You need a good MRV, monitoring, reporting, verification, but you need also a good, central authority to set a cap, to decide on a cap, and to impose the cap, and to have sanctions in case there are cheating. Because, when emissions mean money, there is a risk of cheating, which we also had on cours de route in our ETS. There were some allowances stolen. We got the operators, they are in jail, they had to repair the damage. And that was giving a boost to the governance system, and a boost to, for example, a central registry that the European Commission is holding. Because if you transfer allowances from person A to person B, you have to have a register where that change in ownership is taken care of, is accurately, defined. And, that means the governance system that needs to be good. And that makes a complicated thing. And that explains, in my view, why only strong governments have been able to come forward with ETS systems. China has copied our system or made our system adapted to the Chinese circumstances, let's put it that way. But others are now trying to do that as well. Turkey is fairly advanced. Brazil is very advanced, Indonesia. But of course, there are always hurdles, on cours de route that needs to be cleared up. So establishing the system depends a lot on a good governance, a good central authority that can impose rules and that can make it work. So good governance, that's a first requirement. And then following from good governance is, of course, solid cap setting. You have to have a good guess on how fast you would like to go. We live in a democracy. That rate of decrease of the cap is subject to democratic decision making. And there are always people who would like to go faster and always people who want to go slower. And that is the case in Europe and on the 2040 targets that we are currently discussing. But that's not different in other countries. The cap needs to be defined and needs to be clear to everybody. But good governance is what makes the whole thing essential to implement. But the major benefit of all that is that you reduce emissions at the lowest cost possible, and you create a business incentive for the take-up of clean technologies. And I think that is the essence of what we can observe, in the European system over, say, 20 years.
Yeah. Awesome. And then maybe as the final question, as you've mentioned, prices have become higher. We've done the lowest cost options in terms of reductions. Going forward, we've got the carbon border adjustment mechanism. We've got the EU ETS 2. These are all, to me, very novel and innovative ideas that, again, the EU is pushing forward. Are there lessons from the process that are being incorporated? As in, there was cooperation with the states. Some things didn't go the way you expected them to go. Lessons were learned. Is there like things that go into that process now that you've observed?
Absolutely. International competition, carbon leakage is certainly a thing that is going to be very important. As of the 1st of January 2026, we have the CBAM getting in real action. So it's going to be very important to assess what the impacts are, how good it is functioning, where improvements have to be made, etc., etc. So international competition and carbon leakage is going to stay with us as an issue, yeah, and that is related to the carbon price as well. In the past we didn't need a CBAM. The prices were much lower. Now the prices are high, and the prices may go even higher, because we are talking about emission reductions higher on the cost curve. And, there is a tendency to have more expensive prices. That creates the liquidity question and the question that some are discussing about volatility of carbon pricing or carbon prices. And, I think one thing we have to consider is the functioning of the market stability reserve that functioned towards an over-liquid market, and to address too low carbon prices. Perhaps we have to have a complement to the market stability reserve, considering phases or not enough liquidity and of price spikes. So the market stability reserve, in my view, merits a solid assessment of how good it worked and how it can be revised in a following stage to address a system that is going for the remaining emission reductions that are going to be much more expensive, and that is going to face up also Europe into a number of questions to be sorted out in the trade dimension. We have the trade dimension. China is dumping lots of clean technologies in Europe and in the world. We have the Trump element of the United States. So we are in the middle of very important changes in the framework, in the geopolitical framework, in which the ETS has been flourishing. But now we have big changes. I mentioned, the gas availability from Putin, Russia, cheap gas is out of the question for Europe as well. So the main switching away from coal to gas is now to be put in a completely different context. So the geopolitical dimension, trade in particular, trade in energy commodities, trade in energy intensive commodities I think is going to become a consideration that we have to, address for sure in the next review of the ETS.
Thank you so much for coming on. I really enjoyed this
Yeah,
conversation,
yeah.
and I found it very insightful.
Okay, well, welcome. And, as you say, it's a fascinating subject because it's always the world around the ETS is changing all the time. So that's why I'm still following very closely what's happening and, here and there, inspiring, those who are doing the work now with ideas and options, of addressing one or the other element. Huh? Okay.
Yeah, this will definitely do that. This is the end of the episode. I'd like to thank you for listening all the way to the end. And if you have any advice on how to improve the podcast or advice on future guests or episodes or ideas, please let me know. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks so much. Have a great day.